Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the E-Institute's e-webinar. Today we're talking about the right to information, designing laws to support effective implementation. For those of you who may not have met me yet, I'm Victoria Lemieux, Senior Public Sector Specialist here at the World Bank, and I'm very pleased to be presenting this session to you. And Toby Mendel will be our speaker today. Toby is the Executive Director for the Center of Law and Democracy, which is an NGO that conducts research and education related to human rights, focused on the media, and of course focused on freedom of expression and access to information, which is our topic today. And prior to founding the Center for Law and Democracy, Toby was the Senior Director for Law at Article 19, which is another NGO focused on access to information and human rights, as many of you may know today. I'm looking to see, we have a number of participants from all around the globe. I'm delighted to welcome all of you. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Toby to present to us, and then we'll follow that with some our usual poll questions and some question and answers. So over to Toby.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me add my good morning, good afternoon, good evening welcome to what Vicky has said. I'm here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's 11 o'clock in the morning for us, and I'm hoping that the weather, wherever you are, is better than it is here. We've gone from minus 18 degrees to plus 4 degrees, and from heavy snow to heavy rain, which is just about the worst of everything for this time of year. So hoping that you're having something better than that. So to start with an overview of what I'm going to be presenting, and the issue really is how to design right to information, access to information, freedom of information laws. I'll use the term right to information in my presentation, so as to facilitate effective implementation of those laws without sacrificing the robustness of those laws in the sense of their strength in terms of giving effect to the right to information. Now, that's an issue which applies to any law. I mean, any law needs to be, to take into account the challenges of implementation and to be designed so as to be practical in an implementation sense. And it's intuitively obvious, I think, that such design is important, is very important, or things won't work, particularly for a law like a right to information law, which, as we all know, often has serious implementation challenges. And it's, I think, a little bit of a paradox that despite this obvious need, it's not clear how much attention has been given to this in terms of actual legal design. I can say from my own experience, and I have worked quite extensively in a lot of different countries advising governments and also working with civil society to develop access to information, right to information laws. I can say there's certainly a significant reluctance in a lot of countries to engage in innovation. So if somebody else hasn't already done it, it's quite difficult to convince, in most cases, governments to do something a little bit different. And I think that if you look at some of the more successful right to information laws in countries like India and Mexico, one of the real differences in those contexts is that they were willing to engage in innovation. Those laws introduced new types of arrangements, which in many cases have been quite successful. Of course, when you innovate, some things won't be successful, but that's the kind of the cost benefit of innovation. But if you don't try to innovate, then you'll never experience those higher successes. We have over 100 right to information laws today, 103 depending on how you count, and we have a lot of experience with implementation challenges. So we have a lot of material that could have received more attention. I mean, those laws go back 250 years. We're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the first law, the Swedish law, next year. But I guess it's the last 15 or 20 years that we really have a lot of laws in different environments that we can learn from in terms of the sort of implementation experience. And again, I think probably most people on this webinar already know this, but there was a very significant policy practice gap with right to information laws. Again, this is a feature which is present for the implementation of any law. No law is implemented perfectly, but the policy practice gap with the right to information is often very, very significant. And that sort of, again, drives the need for more thinking about legal design so as to facilitate implementation. And perhaps putting it differently, it's not easy to get a good law. Believe me, I've worked in enough countries to know that, but it's still a lot easier to get a good law than to get strong implementation. So the paper looks at this issue under four main headings. I guess there would be any number of ways to organize something like this, but the first one is the direct impacts, and these are the areas where there should be, without the policy practice gap, a pretty direct causal relationship between the provisions in the law and how it gets implemented. For example, if the law says that Parliament is subject to the obligation of openness, then it just is, and if the law doesn't make Parliament subject to the obligation of openness, then it isn't. There's not a lot of play. There's a one-to-one relationship, if you will, between the provisions in the law and the way they're supposed to be implemented. The second area is about central support bodies, and we'll talk more about this later, but the paper identifies three main categories of central support bodies: nodal bodies, which are bodies inside of government, inside of the executive branch of government, which provide support, information commissioners, external public bodies that can provide support, and the courts. The third area, and obviously we're going to come back to each of these and discuss them in more detail. The third area is what I call bureaucratic integration and fit, which looks at a package of essentially internal issues for the bureaucracy, for public bodies, individual public authorities, how the information officer function is designed, how the rules on RTI are integrated into the bureaucracy, the various internal systems for delivering the right to information or for supporting the delivery of the right to information, reporting, records management, training, and so on. And then the fourth one, which also is kind of one of those systems that I mentioned just now, proactive disclosure. As a general comment for all of these areas, I would note that enforcement is a challenge. Enforcement is relatively robust, at least legally, in relationship to requests. In many laws, you have an internal appeal, an external administrative appeal, and an appeal to the courts. I'm kind of conscious as I say this that many of you may be dropping your jaws as I say that enforcement is robust in terms of requests, because of course in actual practice many requests are not dealt with properly and the oversight mechanisms are not effective. But what I mean when I say that is that the legal design, at least, is robust around these things. Whether that works in practice and the various ways in which that can fail in practice is a slightly different question. But if we look at the more systemic issues that are the focus of our conversation today, the enforcement mechanisms are much weaker. If we look, for example, at proactive disclosure, records management, annual reporting, in terms of systems, proactive disclosure, institutional measures as well, appointment of information officers, training, which are requirements in many laws, but there are very often no or limited mechanisms to enforce those rules. In some cases, in rather a few cases though, India and Mexico stand out again as positive examples of this. Oversight bodies have a role in requiring public authorities to put in place structural measures to address weaknesses in the systems and institutional measures areas. But But I note that even in those cases, the power of those oversight bodies to impose obligations often arises only in the context of individual requests. So somebody makes an individual request, there's a problem in the way that that's processed, they appeal that request to the oversight body, and looking at the issue through the filter of that complaint, the oversight body can then say, okay, you haven't appointed an information officer, your officers are not sufficiently trained, you need to take measures to address that. That's one of the stronger measures that we find, but it's still systemically biased in the sense that certain kinds of implementation issues are very unlikely to be to come to light through individual requests, appeals. For example, if a body has not proactively disclosed information in the way that it should, that's not something that's likely to be exposed by an individual request. It's not impossible, but it's sort of structurally less likely. Or if a body hasn't reported on its implementation, even though that's a requirement under the law, an individual complaint is unlikely to lead to that particular weakness being exposed. So there's a structural bias in the sense that these individual complaints will expose certain structural problems, but be less likely to expose other structural problems. And in a few countries, there are legal sanctions for failures to implement. In some countries, for example, requesters may sue for compensation for direct losses. I think it's obvious what I said before about structural biases and the kinds of problems that these mechanisms identify. That's even more so in terms of legal sanctions. For a requester actually to suffer a financial loss, it's unlikely to be related to a series of structural or systemic obligations that public bodies have. And in some cases, court sanctions against public authorities for failure to discharge their obligations, which can be quite broad in nature and apply to any of these systems that I'm talking about. Those are envisaged. I don't think I've ever read anything about how that works or whether those have been applied or how effective those are. I don't even know how frequently or if ever those kinds of cases are put to courts. So we need more research on this area, and we probably also need more imaginative approaches. I mean, beforehand, I was talking more about the sort of the stick side of the equation, the Information Commission or the oversight body imposing obligations on public authorities, courts doing the same sort of thing. We probably need to have a more balanced package of carrot and stick measures. We probably also need some internal systems for this, so systems within government, so that you're not sort of going outside and through a complaints basically function or an oversight body function, but also an internal, more promotional sort of from within the system, as it were, approach here. I think it certainly would be a good idea for more countries to emulate this approach in a small number of countries where the oversight body has the power to require structural measures to be taken, at least via appeals and complaints, as I mentioned, but perhaps also via suo motu investigations, so that the oversight body could investigate public bodies and say, okay, you're not doing this or that or the other. One weakness with that approach, I think, is that it would require quite a lot of resources on the part of the oversight body. Processing a complaint about a failure to provide information, it can be complex enough, but it's relatively simple than sort of going inside of a public authority and investigating what isn't working in their whole information system. And very few oversight bodies have the kinds of resources that would allow them to really systematically go out and review even the bottom 20% of performers in terms of public authorities, let alone sort of more than that. So I think that there are some limitations to that but at least having that power could address some of the more serious offenders, and then perhaps others would pull up their socks a little bit so as not to be identified in that way. I think that a system of public recommendations and responses, so less coercive in nature, but just exposing the problem. So, and by that I mean a system whereby the oversight body could highlight a problem, and that highlighting of the problem would trigger responsibility on the public authority concerned to respond publicly to the oversight body. So the oversight body could say, you know, your officers aren't trained, and the public authority would have to then respond and say, okay, yes, we agree, we're going to do the training, or we think they're trained well enough, or whatever, and all of that in the public. I think that could be, it's a sort of a softer measure, but I think it could also be reasonably effective, probably more so in countries where the sort of rule of law and public pressure in civil society are stronger. Also, perhaps consider more explicit powers on courts to address structural problems. I think in most legal systems, courts have inherent powers to address administrative law failures. So where public authorities fail to obey the law, whatever law, of an administrative nature, whatever law that might be, courts often have an inherent power to, and often fairly broad remedial powers to order them to do this or that or the other. And that area of law has developed very significantly over the last 30, 40 years in most countries. But courts remain fairly wary of imposing obligations on public bodies, even though it may fall within their inherent powers, where that involves spending. And telling bodies to conduct training or to manage their records better or to proactively disclose more information, all of those are spending related actions, and courts historically have been fairly reluctant to do that. So I think giving them explicit power in the RTI law, making it clear that Parliament, which passed the law, and the government, which presumably supports the law, does actually want them to take these sorts of measures. I think that could perhaps ease that reluctance a little bit. There are, of course, not all legal systems envisage these sorts of measures being imposed on public authorities, and in fact those sorts of measures have arisen fairly recently, and by recently I mean in the last sort of 40 years in most countries. Probably as countries develop more sophisticated administrative law systems, they will start having those sorts of measures, because if you want to enforce administrative law, courts have to be able to sort of wield a stick on public bodies. Okay, so getting now to the first substantive area, and I have identified three main areas where direct impacts are more significant. The first is the scope of the law in terms of the bodies and the information and people it covers. The second is the procedures for making requests and processing those requests, and the third is the exceptions. And the key issue here is in terms of how the law can improve implementation, I think is in terms of administrative discretion. That's most of the recommendations in some way or another revolve around trying to constrain or guide administrative discretion. And that is, excessive administrative discretion is a problem in terms of the right to information for a number of reasons. The first is that it leads to differential application of the rules. So if public bodies, for example, set their own fees, or even make their own decisions about what things can be charged for, then you are going to get situations where individuals make a request to one public body for some type of information, and they get that maybe for free or for very little, and they make the same request to another public body, and they're charged an enormous bill. And that, of course, leads to it's a fairness issue. You should expect fair and equal treatment from different public authorities, but it also leads to public distrust and lack of faith in the system, and then the thing starts to break down because of that. So that sort of undermines public confidence and leads to inconsistent expectations. Discretion obviously also provides opportunities for abuse, and we can see this in the application of these laws in many, many different areas, but I guess exceptions is probably the most the most obvious and the most sort of in-your-face one. And in many countries, you see public authorities, when they refuse to provide access, instead of saying, okay, this is the exception, and having a sort of a well thought out and carefully reasoned argument about that exception, they provide a shopping list of exceptions, anything that might possibly sort of get them over the threshold in front of a court or in front of an oversight body. And that, I mean, as a lawyer, you know, when we take a case to court, that's exactly what we do. We make every possible argument that might win our case, sometimes even fairly offbeat ones, and sometimes those are the ones that win you the case. And of course, that's fair enough in the legal process, because we're in an adversarial process and we're trying to win our case. But here we're dealing with public authorities under a specific obligation to interpret exceptions narrowly and precisely, so as not to undermine the fulfillment of a human right, because of course the right to information is a human right. So going for the shopping list approach is totally inappropriate and is essentially an abuse of administrative discretion. And there are many, many other areas where excessive discretion can lead to abuse. Excessive discretion also imposes a burden on officials. For example, the interpretation of exceptions is often a very time-consuming and difficult task for public authorities. Making that clearer and more precise will reduce the burden on them. Putting in place conditions like who may make a request. If you only allow citizens to make requests, then the public authority is now facing another task in applying this law. It needs to find out whether the person is in fact a citizen. It's an additional task for them. If you put conditions on the type of information, they have to undertake an inquiry as to whether the information falls within that condition. It's another task for them. So it's not often looked at from that angle, but it definitely imposes an additional burden on public bodies and officials. And it also imposes an obligation on requesters, for example, to prove that they are citizens. Some people may not have, especially marginalized groups, may not have the information they need, the documentation they need to prove that they're a citizen. And basically, you can reduce administrative discretion by having clearer and simpler definitions. It's easier for an official to apply a simpler definition, and it's harder for them to exercise discretion within that. And also using examples to show the scope of the, for example, an exception. So, for example, national security. In terms of scope of authorities covered, there are two main approaches here. One is to have a list in the law which says exactly which authorities are covered, Authority A, Authority B, Authority C, and the other is to have a definition. And this is actually a counterexample of everything I've just been saying, because obviously a list is absolutely clear and it basically doesn't involve any administrative discretion, but it also dates quickly over time and can lead to situations where new public bodies or public bodies with newly privatized functions are not covered. I see that Rosemary Agnew, the Scottish Information Commissioner, is on our list, and I was going to quote a recent press release from her office complaining that in Scotland it's becoming a serious problem that the scope of the law has narrowed over time as functions change and functions are privatized. So in this case, I think that even though a definition is in a way more discretionary than a list, it's a preferable approach. I should note, though, that in most cases where you have the list approach, there's also the authority is vested in the responsible minister to declare public authorities to be covered by the law, and that, of course, is a highly discretionary activity. In terms of the scope of people covered, so I've already kind of referred to this a little bit, that imposes an additional step, an additional burden on public authorities. We do have such a rule in Canada. Only citizens and residents, Canada where I live, citizens and residents are allowed to make requests. I have to say that I have never ever been asked for specific proof that I'm a citizen or a resident. Just having a an address in Canada is considered to be enough for that. Obviously, that's not proper evidence, because non-residents can have an address to a friend, or because they're visiting on holiday or whatever. And it's also, public authorities are, and this, the Canadian example illustrates that, public authorities are not well positioned to figure out whether someone's a citizen or a resident. They can ask for a document if they even go that far, which, as I said, in Canada they don't. But to verify that and go through the steps, I mean, it's sort of a condition which is impossible in a way for them to apply properly. And then finally, in terms of the scope of information, often you find very vague and almost ununderstandable qualifiers for the right to information. For example, information of official purposes, or sometimes even public information, which sort of asks the question, if it's public already, then why do we need the law to deal with it? In fact, I'm just reviewing an analysis of the Ukrainian law, and one of the complaints is exactly that it uses that term public information, and officials often get confused about what that actually means. Okay. Looking at my papers here. So procedures are one of the direct impact areas. Normally speaking, the procedure should be defined in the law, and if it says the response should be responded to in 15 days, and that is what it should be, what should happen. Obviously, both digital and paper requests should be enabled. Digital requests, if both parties, let's say the requester and the public authority, are digitally enabled, then that's a much simpler way of doing things. Equally, obviously, not everybody's digitally enabled, so you need to preserve non-digital requests. Hard time.
Heads up that we've got about 5 more minutes, so if you could focus on some of your main points.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe stick to some of the highlights. Exceptions, a very challenging area because it's very difficult to define clearly many of these concepts, sometimes inherently so, like national security and privacy are inherently general concepts. There are also some exceptions which are notoriously general in nature, like internal documents, and I think it's very important to ensure that all of the exceptions refer to an interest as opposed to a category. For example, in many countries, cabinet documents are excluded. Cabinet documents is not an interest, that's a type of document. An interest would be the free and frank exchange of information within government. Both the harm test and the public interest override are almost inherently difficult because of what is prejudice, what is a sufficiently serious or imminent risk of prejudice to qualify. These are highly legal concepts which information officers not necessarily find easy to apply. And I think, again, clear definitions and precise rules can help with that, but there's always going to be a bit of a discretion issue there. Okay, moving on to the next issue, which is about central support bodies. And these bodies really undertake 3 types of functions. One is processing complaints, so oversight bodies. The second is internal support, so providing support to help public authorities discharge their obligations, training, tracking requests, guidance, and so on and so forth. And the third is what I would call external support, so support oriented towards citizens, raising their awareness, helping them more effectively use the law. And cross-cutting that, there are, as I would describe it, 3 different types of central bodies. One is nodal bodies, by which I mean bodies which are part of the executive. So they're internal in that sense, and they tend to focus on the second role, almost never do the first role, and may have some area of activity in the third role. Administrative oversight bodies, information commissions, which are public bodies but not part of the administration, and they often undertake all 3 roles, and then courts, which almost only focus on the first role, although there are a few countries where they have a slightly wider roles. For oversight bodies, the primary function is almost always complaints. It's obvious that they need to be independent to undertake this role satisfactorily. If they're too close or connected to or under the control of the bodies whose actions they're reviewing. That review obviously won't be an independent or a proper review. And you can have independence without proper guarantees in the law because the government appoints a very, very independent person and in fact doesn't interfere. But over time, I think you need strong structural guarantees of independence in most countries to maintain independence over time. And there are, I mean, I won't get into the details here, but there are a lot of specific ways in which legal design can improve the independence through the appointments process and other ways of protecting independence. There's a significant debate about whether there should be, whether these oversight bodies need to be dedicated bodies, so specialized information commissions who do nothing else but review information issues, and often also privacy issues or data protection issues, which is a highly related function, or whether you can attach this function to a pre-existing body, an ombudsman, a human rights commission. Those are the most likely candidates. And I think there are strong arguments in favor of dedicated bodies, although the literature is not absolutely unanimous on this point, I guess I would have to say. And the first is about resources. And technically, there's no reason why you couldn't allocate the same level of resources to a pre-existing body for the new information function, but very often the very reason that you've given this function to an existing body is because you don't want to spend much money on it. So in practice, I think that almost never happens. In terms of specialization as well, having a body which only focuses on these issues, it's going to be more specialized on these issues. If you tack this function onto the activities of another body, the main focus and orientation of that body will always be in its other area, which often is a very large area like human rights commissions, and there will always be sort of secondary importance given to the specialization in the area of access to information. And I think the third, even most difficult perhaps, area of the strongest reason why it's important to have a dedicated body is because information oversight requires tailored powers, for example, in terms of investigating whether public bodies have properly refused to disclose information that are very different from the kinds of powers that are normally vested in ombudsmen and human rights commissions. So I think there's strong arguments for dedicated bodies. It's important that these bodies, and getting now into those dedicated powers, that they have the kinds of powers they need to investigate complaints. They need to be able to review the information. They need to be able to compel witnesses to appear. And they also need to be able to conduct inspections, to actually go to the premises of a public authority and, for example, verify whether in fact it doesn't hold the information as it claims it doesn't. They also need the proper remedial powers, obviously for requesters, and as I mentioned earlier, also in terms of structural measures. There's a huge debate about whether these bodies need, I shouldn't say huge, but there's a significant debate about whether these bodies need to have binding powers or recommendation powers are enough. And just, I mean, there's a lot of issues on both sides of that equation. I think perhaps for me the most significant, and I'm a strong supporter of binding powers, is a survey that was conducted by the Scottish-based information body. I can't remember the name exactly right now, but and they did a survey among information commissioners, and the statistics for those which said that their decisions were complied with in all cases or a significant majority of cases, so those two desirable points, was 85% for binding power bodies and only 45% for non-binding power bodies. So I think that's kind of a very strong evidence in this area. Okay, so central bodies also need to provide support, importantly for the internal support for public authorities. And this is a massive efficiency in the sense that basically all of the hundreds of public bodies in every country need to do essentially similar types of things to implement the law. And rather than having each of them do it separately, having a central body either do it centrally for them, for example, in terms of tracking requests, you can have a central system for that. In terms of training, you can just have a central system for that, or at least providing them with not quite ready-made or off-the-shelf models for the things they need to do, but at least a clear instructions and guidelines about how they need to do things. That's a massive efficiency, so they don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. And it's another paradox, as far as I'm concerned, that this is very often significantly neglected, that resources are not sufficiently allocated to a central body to provide those kinds of supports for public authorities. And where those kinds of resources are allocated, I think it can make a huge difference in terms of successful implementation. I would point here to Mexico, perhaps, as a leading example of that, where the oversight body, IFI, is a very, very well-resourced body and has developed very, very strong central support tools, which I think have really helped make the system work more effectively there. There's a question about whether nodal or oversight bodies should be the primary bodies doing this role. I mean, I think there are arguments on both sides. Nodal bodies are closer to public authorities. They're sort of inside of the bureaucracy. They understand better in a closer way how the bureaucracy works. They're more likely to be trusted by the bureaucracy. But, I mean, as I've just mentioned, Mexico, of course, is a counterexample. That in Mexico is the external oversight body. Okay. Integration into systems. Yeah, I know I'm running.
We have about 3 minutes. We have some really great questions and discussions on the chat. So I just like to ask you to make some final key points. And then what I'd like to do is open it up to the question and answer, because we've really got some great input here from our participants, and I'd like you to be able to respond to that.
Yeah, no, sure. Okay, so, I mean, in terms of integration into systems, this is a major project for public authorities to deliver, and like any major project that they're delivering, it needs to be integrated into their core planning and other systems, into their resource allocation, into their human resource allocation, their budgeting systems, and that happens surprisingly rarely. Often, and in terms of, allocating human resources, for example, to information officers, often information officers are just given this job and they're expected to do it on top of whatever else they're doing. So it's kind of another one of the paradoxes about the way that this system works. The information officer function, this is obviously a core part of the successful delivery from within the public authorities of these laws. Often information officers carry the burden or the responsibility of implementing the law. Thought needs to be given to how the information officer is structured. If you're a small, highly centralized public authority, then having one information officer sitting in the central office probably will work. But if you're the election commission in Indonesia, a country of 240 million people with offices all across the country covering 7,000 islands, one central officer isn't going to work. So much more thought needs to be given into that. And in a number of cases, there are provisions in the law which facilitate that. I won't go into the detail of that right now. It's also very, very important that the scope of responsibility of information officers be clarified. Probably, or possibly partly in the law, but at least in terms of their job descriptions and the terms of reference that are associated with that position. If that isn't the case, then they don't have the power that they need to discharge their responsibilities, so they don't have official responsibility for anything. They're just sort of, yes, this is your job, but there's no terms of reference associated with that. And there will also often be a series of, especially the systemic tasks like annual reporting, which fall between the cracks because nobody is given particular responsibility for that. And again, this is something which in many contexts is just missing. I mean, information officers said, okay, you're the information officer, here's the law, go do what you're supposed to do, and no clear terms of reference or anything like that. Okay, I'll skip over this. I mean, there is a lot of interesting issues around how sanctions are designed. Basically, criminal sanctions, which you find in most laws, are almost never applied anywhere, and that means that they're effectively not, well, they're not effective. So administrative sanctions, I think, are a much more productive thing to look at. Protections for information officers. Okay, I'm going to skip quickly over all of this, actually. So the reporting, there needs to be a system designed for how the reports take place. Records management, Vicky's going to kill me for skipping over this one quickly, but this is a very important one. Obviously, if you can't find the information, you can't give it. This is a significantly underdeveloped area in almost all of these right to information laws, and I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps to some extent it has fallen into the cracks because it sort of falls between the right to information and the archival laws, but in fact archival laws rarely deal with live records management. That's to say, records management during the time that they're held by the originating authority. And I think the essentials of what are required here is that some central body has the power to set and to enforce binding standards in terms of record management, and probably in a flexible way so that standards can be increased over time. Training, obviously, a very important system, and proactive disclosure. Again, it's a kind of an interesting issue because in modern era, proactive disclosure obligations or proactive disclosure practices in a lot of countries have gone way, way beyond the minimum requirements in the law, whereas in lower capacity settings, a lot of public authorities can't even meet the obligations in the law. So there's sort of catch-22 here, and basically some kind of system which allows for standards to be ratcheted up over time in some kind of binding way. So the open data movement has resulted in masses more information being disclosed, but in a highly discretionary way in many cases, basically what governments are interested in disclosing, so they proactively disclose through open data, and having a legal system and framework behind that can at least set minimum standards that all public bodies have to meet, I think would be very useful. Come to the conclusion, the four main areas, as you can see there: limiting discretion, institutional design, systemic design, and integrating into the bureaucracy. The many recommendations in the paper basically fall into those four categories. And I think the challenge here is how to develop legal designs in a way that facilitate implementation, ease implementation, and yet don't sacrifice standards. And I now come to the
Toby, thank you so much for this rich presentation. I mean, one of the challenges of knowing so much and having so much experience is condensing it into a very brief time. And so I just remind everyone that's on the participating in the webinar today that Toby's full paper is available for download, and also a recording of this session will be available. So you'll be able to go back and review what Toby has said, and we'll have a short podcast as well if you're pressed for time. So I thank all of the participants who have been chatting away and posing questions. And if any of you who haven't posed a question so far have a question to pose, please do type your question into the chat. So I'll just start with a question that Abdelaziz Habib posed early on in the chat when Toby was talking about the role of the courts. And he raised the point about what about countries where the rule of law is quite weak? We can point to some very fragile and post-conflict states where the court system will not necessarily be all that reliable. There may be a lot of constraints. So Toby, what would be your thoughts on those kinds of scenarios?
Yeah, so the paper, and it states this early on, it aims essentially at least medium level rule of law context, because we're talking about legal design, and there's not much point in good legal design if laws are just completely ignored, which is what happens in non-rule of law settings. I think it perhaps could be quite interesting to have another paper or to have another kind of track of consideration about how to get laws that are a little bit more effective even in lower rule of law settings. I think there would be some kinds of designs that would be more robust against poor rule of law contexts, but that would be a completely different consideration. I mean, this paper and these considerations are assuming that there will at least be some respect for the law.
Abdelaziz made the point that perhaps that's a place for civil society to step in and provide some point of pressure. And what would be your thoughts on the role of civil society, say, in those contexts? Would you agree with that point, that they have a much bigger role to play?
Right. Well, I think civil society has an enormous role to play in any context because, I mean, if for example, and I've seen contexts where almost nobody's making requests, and these laws make a pretty big demand on public authorities, do something really significant here, change your whole way of practice and how you relate to the public. And if nobody's interested in that, it's very hard to expect them to really go through all of the steps that this law is requiring them formally, legally to do. So I think in any context, I guess in really low rule of law capacity settings, you're replacing legal provisions with essentially political or social pressure. So yes, civil society is where that kind of pressure would normally primarily be coming from, and so that would be more.
Great. Well, thank you for that. There's another question from Carol Excel. She's asking whether it makes a difference whether the law, for the purposes of implementation, places responsibility for implementation with the Information Commissioner's office or with a nodal agency, as you call it, an agency that is within the executive branch of government. Have you observed any differences in terms of the effectiveness of implementation in those models?
Right. So I think first point that should be made is that there aren't that many countries where a nodal agency has played a fairly significant role. There's lots of countries where nodal agencies play very limited roles, often, for example, very legal advice or regulations roles. So we don't have a huge body of evidence about what the potential impact of a highly empowered nodal body could be. I mean, I think that's a preliminary point. I kind of skipped over it in my presentation, and there's more about it in the paper. I think there are certain inherent advantages to nodal agencies playing the second central support role, that's to say support for public authorities to discharge their obligations. Because they know the public sector better, they're working within it, there's likely to be more trust. The external body is going to be making decisions potentially every single day that are adverse to public authorities, so the relationship between them is, it doesn't have to be terrible, but it's not going to be cozy, at least. And I think nodal agencies can sort of come at it from a much more position of trust, and we're with you and we understand, we're trying to help you do what you need to do rather than monitoring and whacking you over the head when you don't do it right, kind of thing. On the other hand, I guess the strongest examples we have are of strong, highly empowered, like the Mexican Information Commission, which are external, and that's just because I don't think enough governments have given proper thought to the importance of empowered nodal agencies, but I think the potential is certainly there.
Okay, well, thanks so much. So they can play a strong coordinating role, I guess. And Carol had a follow-on question and wanted to ask you about incentive structures to improve implementation. Have you observed, did you consider in your paper how to design well-functioning incentive structures?
Yeah, so it is an issue that was addressed in the paper. I think that particularly for information officers or for people who are playing the information officer function role, I think that positive incentives could potentially be quite important. And I think there are, sort of the obvious ones like job evaluations and making performance in this area part of their job evaluation because it's supposed to be an important part of their job. But I also think that trying to establish more developed career track opportunities for this role. So if you go into government as an economist or as a lawyer, you're sort of on a certain track and you can advance and you can become a senior economist or whatever. And in all too many bureaucracies, the information officer function is kind of seen as a parking place. You go there and whatever, you're not performing very well, so we'll stick you there, rather than this is a place where you can actually grow and learn and build. And I think the evaluations are obviously linked to that, but the bigger thing really is this seen and is it structurally integrated into the bureaucracy in a way that makes it a career track position? It's going to help your career over time, or it's not. And it's difficult, I think, to do that because we all know, I mean, there's this what we call a culture of secrecy, but I mean, that behind that, there are structural incentives against disclosure of information from within bureaucracies for all kinds of complicated reasons. And you're never going to completely reduce that. So the information officers are always going to be facing headwinds from their organization. So it's hard, and you really have to, I really think that we need to look much more carefully at ways to, not just through legal mechanisms and oversight mechanisms, but sort of through internal incentives and positive measures to reduce those at least reduce those headwinds, but make it a promotional career track type of thing.
Right. I want to come back to the question of involving civil society to just share with you some comments from Rosemary Agnew, who is the Information Commissioner for Scotland. And so we have online the voice of experience. So welcome, Rosemary, and thank you very much for your comments. Regarding civil society, she makes the point that it's essential to involve civil society in the drafting of the law as well. Because civil society has the ability to influence and participate in the RTI law. So engagement with civil society all along the way from the drafting through to implementation and beyond is critical. So that point, Toby, you make, and Rosemary is also seconding that. She also wanted to point out some experience from Scotland. She says that after 10 years, rights to information have been lost because of changes in the bureaucracy in the public service. And she's also found that commitments made by the Scottish government to extend freedom of information beyond what is traditionally thought of as public services have not been kept. And I think this comes up in my experience, particularly since in many governments, there's a movement towards public-private partnerships. And so the question of extending the law to these kinds of the public-private partnership type contracts has become of great interest. And so she says the lesson in terms of a robust freedom of information law is to ensure that the right to information builds in the scope for extension at the outset so governments can be held to account. And Toby, I wanted to ask you, if you have any thoughts to share on how we could build in those extensions, because in my experience as well, working this field, it's so difficult to get new laws, into the pipeline and to get changes made to a law once it's out there. So what kind of flexibility mechanisms can be built in?
Yeah, so I sort of mentioned that a bit in my presentation about how there are two approaches here. There's the list approach, which is the approach taken in Scotland, where you have a list, and also in Canada, UK, a list of all of the public bodies by name, and those are the ones that are covered. And if you're not on the list, you're not covered. And so to reflect or to respond to those changes that take place over time, either because new public bodies are created or functions are privatized or whatever it is that's changing the way the public sector works, you need to specifically add to the list. So if you look at sort of in the UK, there are dozens of orders adding and removing public bodies from the list. And it's almost inevitable that will not keep up with the changes. I think having even though it's highly precise and in a way non-discretionary, but it is discretionary because of the addition and removal process, I think having broad definitions built into the law from the outset is a better approach, even though it does involve discretion. But it's sort of one-time discretion, because a body can argue they're not covered by the law and they refuse. But once that gets appealed and the Information Commissioner decides that they are covered, and if that isn't appealed to the courts or whatever, it's kind of over at that point. They are now covered. So it's not an ongoing irritant in terms of discretion. I mean, you can spend a lot of time fighting about the hundreds of public bodies which could or could not be covered. And I think that having laws which cover public functions, okay, that's very vague and subject to a lot of debate and discussion and whatever. So it's sort of the opposite of the anti-discretionary approach that I generally advocate. But I think that it's probably necessary to capture this privatization problem. And then that can be fought out, as I mentioned, through the appeals process, basically.
Okay. So last question, because we're running short on time here. Although I wish, and I'm sure our participants wish we could carry on this discussion, has to do with the role of standards, model laws, and this is going back to a question that Carol Excel posed. Do we need model laws? Do we need detailed procedures, maybe model procedures or standards? What's the right balance? I mean, every country has got its unique situation. As Rosemary Agnew has pointed out, what's the balance between having model laws and standards and the unique requirements of each country? And what role might these play?
So as an entirely objective observer on this issue, somebody who's drafted model laws and standards, but perhaps more than anyone else, no, but I think that, I mean, trying to be objective as possible on this, I think that there are certain areas where, you know, adaptation based on local circumstances is limited. For example, the regime of exceptions. National security, I mean, the precise national security interests in one country or another are different, but that doesn't require a different definition of national security in the law. And in fact, any country can find themselves facing national security challenges that are faced by any other country, as it were. Privacy, again, I mean, obviously there's going to be a certain cultural underlay for what specifically is considered private, but the rules in the law, I think, can be fairly standardized. You mentioned the procedures. I think it's another area where, you know, I mean, you can choose 10, 15, 20 days to respond to a request, but I mean, you know, these are minor tweaks, as it were. But when it comes to the more institutional design type features, the oversight bodies, the allocation of responsibilities between nodal bodies and oversight bodies, the information officer function, who within the public body is responsible for the different sorts of things. There's a lot of different things need to be done. That often just gets dumped onto the information officer, but often that doesn't work because, for example, the information officer can't do the reporting if there's no proper system for collecting the information. So, I mean, allocating responsibility, those sorts of more institutional issues, I think, need to be more carefully designed for each country. So, you know, a bit of this and a bit of that in a way. But I think in the other areas, and even in those areas, I think models which are looked at as a model as opposed to the model, I still think can be helpful because they provide some kind of ideas, at least, for people to start with.
Right. Toby, thank you so much. I'm sad to say we have to wrap it up there. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge. All the details, which people will be able to reflect on at much greater length, are available in Toby's paper. And you can come back, of course, to the recording of this e-webinar and the podcast as well. The paper, the recording, the podcast will be available our website, which is the, if you Google World Bank Transparency and Information Management, then you'll be able to find our website. And I also post to the OGP listserv, and we'll post up our upcoming discussions, because this webinar forms the a part of our open discussion series on transparency and information management. Our next discussion is coming up next Thursday, in fact, and it will be presented by Abdelaziz Abid, who is on the call today, on the participant in the webinar today. So thank you very much, Abdelaziz, who will be discussing the right to information in Morocco. And we really look forward to learning more from you about that. The following week, we'll have Alaire Livingston, who will be talking about developments in the right to information in the Caribbean region. And the following week after that, February 26th, we'll have the World Bank team here talking about how do we implement the access to information in the World Bank. So we've got a really good series of talks coming up for you, and I really look forward to having you join. So just in closing, thank you all for your participation. The questions, the discussion were fabulous. I so much appreciate your being so engaged. Please do review the paper, send us your comments. I'd also remind you that on the website, the recordings of past e-webinars by Stephanie and papers that other papers that she and others have produced. So please feel free to download those resources as well. So just a last reminder to also give us your feedback on this particular session. Send us your comments. And I look forward to seeing you again on the next one and having you participate in our upcoming open discussions. Thank you and goodbye, everyone.